Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from RAU'S IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of RAU'S IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates. Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of the newspaper analysis from the Civil Services Examinations perspective. So today we are going to discuss The Hindu Delhi edition dated 8th April 2022. The topics to be discussed have been displayed on your screen and the timestamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. So this topic has appeared in today's The Hindu Delhi edition on page number 6. So this is the lead article which has appeared in the context of the Russian-Ukraine war, India's stand in this context, and the West Asian nations' criticism against the Indian stance. So that is why this topic falls under the UPSC scheme of syllabus in the General Studies Paper 2 section in the subsection of International Relations. So if you closely analyze the context of this very article is the Indian stand at Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, as we all know that for the last few years, India was witnessing very close relationship, the growing relationship with countries like USA. So that is why it was expected that in this war also India will take this stand which will conform with the standards of USA, the notions of USA. That is why many expected India to give up its strategic autonomy and take a stand that aligns with that of the West. However, we have seen that at many times at several international platforms, India has taken a neutral stand. India has abstained from voting against Russia. Neither it has voted in favor of Russia nor against Russia. So that means India's stand is in conformation with the neutral standards. And that is why what several people were expecting that India will take this stand in conformation with the USA stand, it has not happened. Now, in this context, an important word is their strategic autonomy. Now, this word is very important because these days this word is making a huge buzz in newspapers, and that is why you need to be aware about the concept that what exactly is meant by strategic autonomy, how has India experienced this strategic autonomy, and why has India chosen strategic autonomy over aligning with some dominant bloc. So first of all, we will understand that what is meant by this strategic autonomy word. Now, as we all know that the foreign policies of any countries are governed on the principles of national interests. Despite the fact that moral commitments are also very important, but the point is that moral commitments are also made in a fashion to preserve the country's national interests. Because we cannot go with the morality standards which are against the national interest. So that is why the strategic autonomy balances the national interest as well as the moral commitments. However, if there is a dilemma between taking the national interest over the moral commitments, national interest gains significance, they overrule the moral commitments. So, in this very sense, strategic autonomy gives the power to a country to pursue its national interest in the foreign policy without being constrained by any foreign power. So, in common terms, strategic autonomy makes the country superior with respect to the other countries as far as the decision making is concerned in terms of foreign policy. Which means that if we have a country, India, and India has to decide some foreign policies. So India is superior in this sense, which means that no other country, whether it is US, whether it is China, whether it is Russia, no other country can compel India to take the stance which conform to their individual standards. India will take the stand which will preserve its own national interest without facing any constraint from any countries across the world. So this is basically the strategic autonomy. Many a times in international relations it happens that multiple countries with which we are partner, they confront each other. For example, in this Russia-Ukraine conflict, there is an indirect confrontation between Russia as well as USA. But we have friendly relations to US as well as Russia. So in this complex situation, every country must possess the power of strategic autonomy, which India is already possessing it. And that is why we see that despite several sanctions, India has continued to trade with Russian countries. India has evaded the CATSA restrictions also, and further, India has abstained from voting against Russia in the United Nations as well as their subsidiary organizations. So, on one hand, India has maintained a considerable difference going against Russia. And on the other hand, India has also been successful to establish and strengthen the relations with USA. For example, India is the founding member of the Quad grouping, in which US is also a dominant player. Further, India has also entered into the foundational agreements with USA, which are somewhat strategic agreements. So, in this fashion, if you go by these examples, on one hand, India has maintained its friendly relationship with Russia, and on the other hand, India has also strengthened its relation with the USA. So that is why it is said that India is not facing any constraint from any foreign power, and India is pursuing its own national interests, following the policies and principles of strategic autonomy. But as we all know that in recent times, in the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the criticism from the West against India has grown multiple fold. Especially the statements from the Washington has come in such a way that they are blaming India because India has remained silent. They say that India has remained silent. India has not taken the moral grounds. They have not gone against Russia. And if you are not going against Russia, somehow, somewhere, you are breaching the moral standards, moral commitments in the international policies. So, in this backdrop, now we will discuss that why India is following the principles of strategic autonomy. What are the reasons behind India's response? So, the first reason that it has to follow the principles of strategic autonomy because in present times the global order is changing very rapidly. For example, in last 5 to 6 years, world has witnessed the Crimean annexation in 2013, American withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, and Russian invasion in 2022. Given the situation is so complex, the global order is changing so rapidly, India must possess the freedom to exercise its strategic autonomy and frame its foreign policies in such a manner which is not constrained, which is not restricted by any other country. The second reason is that if we agree that the Western countries are saying that India is not in conformation to the standards as they prescribe, the counter argument is that NATO has failed in protecting its own allies. For example, Russia has attacked the Ukraine very confidently because it was aware about the fact that NATO will not provide the active defense mechanism to the Ukraine. Further, what is the role of the guarantee which is provided by USA or for that matter North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is NATO, to its allies? NATO had given a guarantee to the Ukraine before starting of the war that it will come into defense against Russia, but we know that it has not happened. So now again, if US or Western countries are asking us that where are our moral commitments, we can counter question them that where are your moral commitments? And in continuation of this morality test of the Western countries, the third point come into action. Were the morality standards followed by USA when it invaded Iraq, it invaded Libya, it invaded Afghanistan? So if you are asking us that why aren't we taking stands against Russia, why are you not asking us that why we didn't take stand against you? The point is that on the timeline of the world history, many countries have attacked other countries. And today, if the Western countries are blaming Russia for invading the Ukraine, they should blame themselves too. Now we'll come to the fourth point. Now this point is very important and analytical also. We must see this world from the Indian perspective. And Indian perspective is that presently there are two types of powers which have dominant role in global politics. The first are the major powers. In the major powers, India specially categorizes three countries: the US, Russia, as well as China. So the first groups are the countries which are major powers, which are the superpowers, and other are the middle level players. For example, the countries like India. Now, India is a middle level player. So now, if we look by the Indian perspective, out of these three superpowers, US as well as Russia are the partners of India, and China is the competitor of India. So now we know that in the Russian Ukraine conflict are two very partners, that is US and Russia are also confronting with each other, maybe indirectly. And that is why neutrality is the best possible option. The fifth point is that technically, because we are not the part of any alliance, no other country or no other grouping can compel us to take the stands which conform to their standards. And the last point is that India is not the only country which has taken the stand in such a fashion. Why are you criticizing only the India? South Africa has abstained from voting against Russia. UAE has abstained from voting against Russia. Moreover, UAE is technically the ally of USA. We are not even the ally of any country. Even then, you are pressurizing us. Now, leave UAE. The third point is that Israel, we all know, is the closest ally of the USA. Despite the fact that Israel has offered criticism against the Russian invasion, still Israel has not entered into the sanctions regime which has been ordered by Western countries against Russia. So if your closest ally is not entering into sanctions regime, do you really have that moral ground that you can criticize India? Similarly, Turkey is also a NATO ally which is offering an active mediating role between Russia and Ukraine. So, why are you criticizing only India? Why are you pinpointing India only when many of your allies have taken similar stands which India has taken? So, this article was very analytical in nature, and I believe that this has given you a different perspective to understand the global order as well as the justification that why, in the growing complexities across the global politics, the strategic autonomy principle is very important for India. Now, this topic has appeared in the Hindu Delhi edition at page number 1, that is the front page, and this topic is in the context of the suspension of the Russia's membership from the Human Rights Council, that is United Nations Human Rights Council. In short form, it is known as UNHRC. So now, as you can see, the context is that recently in 2020, Russia was appointed as a member of the Human Rights Council. But in the latest move, United Nations General Assembly, that is UNGA, has voted 93 to 24 ratio to suspend the Russia's membership from the Council. But an important point in this very regard is that the suspension of the rights of the membership requires two-third majority of the present and voting. But as you can see that 58 member countries remained absent. They abstained from voting in the UNGA, and that is why these 58 members will not be taken into this present and voting because they were not present. So leaving behind 58 members, only this much number of countries participated, and in these 93 members voted to suspend the Russian membership. And this resolution to suspend the rights of the membership of the Russian Federation in the Human Rights Council was proposed by countries like Ukraine, US, European Union, and certain Latin American countries. So in this very regard, from the UPSC's preliminary examinations perspective, you must be aware about certain key facts regarding the Human Rights Council. So the Council is the central structure in the global human rights architecture, and it has replaced the Human Rights Commission in 2006. The important key fact is that this council is headquartered in Geneva, which is in Switzerland. As far as the present day is concerned, UNHRC has 47 members, which are elected by the majority of the members of the United Nations General Assembly through direct and secret ballot. Now, this point is very important, that the simple majority of the members of the UNGA is taken into account, and the voting is done through direct but secret ballot. The members who are elected under this voting serve for a period of 3 years but are not eligible for immediate re-election after serving 2 consecutive terms. That means for 2 consecutive terms, the members can be elected, but they can't be elected for the 3rd consecutive term. Further, the period of the members of the council is 3 years. Now we can see that membership is divided as per the regional basis. There are 13 states of Africa, there are 13 seats of Asia Pacific region, 8 seats of Latin America and Caribbean states, 7 seats of West Europe and others, 6 seats of Eastern European states. An important point regarding the Human Rights Council is that unlike the other multilateral institutions, for example the World Bank or the IMF, there is no special privilege for the more developed Western countries. Further, despite this body is there to protect the human rights, but the resolutions of this body are non-binding in nature. Again, this is very important. The resolutions are non-binding. Further, the UNHRC holds regular sessions 3 times a year in March, June, and September. Now, there are two important things which are associated with this commission. There are two important mechanisms. The first is the Universal Periodic Review, and second is the Special Procedure. Now, Universal Periodic Review reviews all the member states every 4 years to ensure universality of the coverage and equal treatment of all the member states. This is basically done in ensure strengthen the equity among all the member countries. The second is the special procedure. Now these are the independent human rights experts and they have a special mandate on the human rights, and these human rights cover all the important dimensions, that is civil, cultural, economic, political and social. Now there is another important term, special rapporteur. Now this is basically a title which is provided to an independent expert and a working group member on behalf of the United Nations. So this was purely a factual topic and that is why mainly relevant from the preliminary perspective, but an important one given the backdrop of the recent suspension of the Russia's membership from this council.
I hope all of you must have come across a very important development with respect to India's external sector. The development was with respect to the fact that the overall exports from India have increased to more than $400 billion for the first time in the financial year 21-22. Now this recent development becomes quite important because this is for the first time that the overall exports from India have increased to more than $400 billion. The highest ever exports registered prior to this was in the year 2018, when the exports had touched an all-time high of $330 billion. So in the light of recent developments with respect to India's external sector, various aspects become important from the perspective of the prelims as well as the mains examination. As you can see in the previous year prelims, questions have been repeatedly asked with respect to various aspects of international trade, that is the composition and direction, and with respect to important trends in India's international trade. As far as the mains related aspect is concerned, one should be aware as to why should India pursue an export-led model, what are the challenges with this export-led model, and what strategies we must pursue in order to address these challenges. Since the prelims examination is fast approaching, I shall not be focusing upon the mains related aspects. I shall be focusing mainly on the prelims related aspects. But at the same time, in order to ensure that you guys don't miss out on the mains related analysis, what I have done here is all the mains related aspects I have incorporated in the PDF for your reference. So as and when you are preparing for the mains examination, you can go through this particular content in order to write an answer related to the external sector. So based upon the content which I have provided in the PDF, you should be in a position to write an answer to this particular mains question for practice. The question is, what are the supply side and demand side challenges before India in pursuing an export-led model? Also highlights the strategies to address these constraints. And once we are done with the prelims related discussion of this particular article, you should be in a position to attempt almost around 7 questions for practice. Let us now start with the analysis of this particular article. I hope all of you must be knowing that whenever we measure the GDP by the expenditure method, we take into account 4 important drivers. These include the private final consumption expenditure, the government final consumption expenditure, the gross capital formation, and the net value of our exports. So net exports, it is actually calculated as total exports minus total imports. So this particular table here shows the contribution of each of these drivers to India's GDP in the financial year 21-22. And as you can see, among these four drivers, it is the private final consumption expenditure which accounts for the highest share. And this is followed by the gross capital formation, which accounts for almost 30% to India's GDP. And this is followed by the government final consumption expenditure, which accounts for 12% of GDP. And at last, we have the net exports, whose contribution is actually negative. It is minus 3% to India's GDP. So as you can see, the overall export of both goods and services from the Indian economy, it accounted for 20% of India's GDP, whereas the overall import of goods and services into the Indian economy, it accounted for 23% of India's GDP. That is why the net exports, which is calculated as total exports minus imports, it is minus 3%. So as far as the prelims examination is concerned, one can expect a question as to arrange these drivers of India's economy either in the descending order or the ascending order. And that is why this particular aspect becomes important. Another important aspect is the concept of the trade to GDP ratio. See, when we say the net exports, it is actually calculated as total exports minus total imports. But when we say trade to GDP ratio, it is calculated as total value of export of both goods and services plus the total value of import of goods and services. So if you calculate the trade to GDP ratio of the Indian economy in the financial year 21-22, this was 20 plus 23, which is approximately equal to 43% of our GDP. So the trade to GDP ratio of the Indian economy in the financial year 21-22 was around 43% of India's GDP. Now what is surprising here is the trade to GDP ratio of India. This is actually much higher than the trade to GDP ratio of China. For India, it is around 43%. For China, way back in the year 2018-19, this was around 35 to 36%. So even this particular aspect becomes important as far as your prelims examination is concerned. Second is, why should India pursue an export-led model? How would it benefit the Indian economy? See, firstly, as you can see, as far as the Indian economy is concerned, it is the private final consumption expenditure which accounts for the highest share. So when we say private final consumption expenditure, it basically means that we are producing goods and services in order to cater to our domestic demand. So we are manufacturing goods, we are producing services in order to cater to the domestic demand. And the problem here is the domestic demand as such cannot continue to increase in future, which means that there is a limit up to which the domestic demand can increase. And beyond a particular level, the domestic demand can no longer increase. So if you continue to rely only on the private final consumption expenditure, India's vision of achieving a $5 trillion economy would become extremely difficult. So in order to achieve the vision of $5 trillion economy, we must not only cater to the domestic demand, but we must also cater to the global demand as well. Which means that we have to manufacture goods, we'll have to produce services, not just to cater to a domestic demand, but also to cater to the global demand. So when we are able to produce goods and services both to cater to the domestic demand as well as to cater to the global demand, then it will become quite easier for us to achieve the vision of $5 trillion economy. The question is, how can we cater to the global demand? We can basically cater to the global demand by exporting more goods and services to other countries. So that is why India needs to pursue an export-led model. So if you look at the advanced economies such as say Japan, South Korea, or more recently even China, they have been able to sustain a very high GDP growth rate by pursuing an export-led model. And that is why the recent development of achieving $4 billion worth exports become extremely important from the perspective of the Indian economy. So as we are able to pursue a high GDP growth rate, we would be able to increase our exports, and as our exports increases, there would be more competition. Our domestic companies will be forced to innovate, they would be forced to improve their efficiency. By doing that, we would be able to create more of jobs. We would also be able to attract more of investment, and as we are able to attract investment, automatically the gross fixed capital formation, which presently accounts for 30% of India's GDP, even this share would increase, and thus India would be able to pursue a virtuous export-led cycle. So the Economic Survey 2018-19 recommended that India needs to shift from consumption-led economy to investment and export-led economy. So by pursuing a investment and export-led economy, we would be able to realize the vision of the $5 trillion economy. Now coming to the important trends in India's external trade. See, before discussing the important trends, let me tell you that all of these trends I have already discussed this as part of my economic survey discussion. But the trends which I am going to discuss now, it is little different from the trends which I have discussed in my economic survey discussion. Now question is why? Now this is because the economic survey presents us a data only for a part of the financial year. That is, to be more specific, the economic survey presents us with the data only for the April 2021 to November 2021 period. It does not provide us with the data for the entire financial year. However, the latest trends which I am going to discuss now, this particular data is provided by the Ministry for Commerce and Industry, and this particular data is for the entire financial year, that is right from April 2021 to March 2022. So as far as your prelims rated aspect is concerned, you should remember the latest data published by the Ministry for Commerce and Industry because it captures the data for the entire financial year. So this is the first thing which I wanted to highlight. Secondly, see the economic survey. Whenever the economic survey talks about the top 5 export commodities or top 5 import commodities, it presents the data in terms of individual commodities. On the other hand, the latest data which is provided by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, it has presented the data in terms of top 5 export commodity groups and top 5 import commodity groups. So as far as economic survey is concerned, it provides us a data in terms of individual commodities. Whereas the latest data provided by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, it provides us a data in terms of commodity groups. Now for example, you have a commodity group known as engineering goods. Now the engineering goods in turn comprises of different individual commodities such as metal products, industrial machinery, auto components, transport equipment and so on. So when the economic survey presents a data, it presents a data for each of these individual commodities, that is metal products, industrial machinery, auto components, transport equipment, etc. But the latest data provided by Ministry of Commerce and Industry, it considers all of these individual commodities as one group, that is the engineering goods, and then it presents the data. So please to remember this, that the economic survey presents the data for exports and imports in terms of individual commodities, whereas the Ministry for Commerce and Industry in its latest data, it has provided the details of exports and imports in terms of commodity groups. So the individual commodities which are closely related to each other, they are grouped under the commodity group and then the data is presented. So keeping this in mind, let us now look into the important trends related to India's external trade. First and foremost, let's have a look at the trends in India's merchandise exports in terms of absolute value. So as you can see here, the overall merchandise exports from India had reached 305 billion mark in the year 2011-12. And it accounted for almost around 17% of India's GDP. So this 17%, I'm saying it in terms of merchandise exports and I'm not taking into account the export of services. So only the merchandise goods alone accounted for 17% of India's GDP in the year 2011-12. And in the last one decade or so, the overall exports from India have fluctuated between $262 billion in the year 2015-16 to $330 billion in the year 2018-19. So in general, if you observe the overall trends in exports in terms of absolute value in the last 4 to 5 years, we cannot see either a decreasing trend or an increasing trend. So overall exports from India in the last 5 to 10 years, they have fluctuated between $262 billion to $400 billion in the last decade. Now this trend as such becomes important. Now, if you look at the trends in India's merchandise exports in terms of percentage of GDP. Now, as I said here, in the year 2011-12, the merchandise exports accounted for 17% of India's GDP. But since then, the overall merchandise exports as a percentage of GDP, they have declined to around 13 to 14%. So what becomes important from the perspective of a prelims examination is, even though exports in terms of absolute value have crossed 400 billion for the first time, but in terms of percentage of GDP, it is much lower than the levels that we had observed in the year 2011-12. So two things are important. One thing is, in terms of absolute value, we are not seeing any kind of increasing or decreasing trend. They have been fluctuating. And second, in terms of percentage of GDP, the overall merchandise exports from India have declined from 17% to around 13 to 14% in the last decade. So these two trends become important. As far as the trends in India's merchandise trade deficit is concerned, see, as discussed in my economic survey discussion, since 1947, India has witnessed merchandise trade deficit for almost say 99.99% of the years. Only for 2 to 3 years, India has witnessed a surplus on its merchandise trade account. That is, only for around 2 to 3 years, the overall export of merchandise goods has been higher than the overall import of merchandise goods. And these years are 1972-73, 1976-77. But otherwise, except these 2 years, for all other years, India has seen a merchandise trade deficit wherein our overall imports was much higher than our export of merchandise goods. And as you can see, as I said, the overall exports from India have increased to an all-time high of $400 billion. But what is also equally interesting is the imports into India have also increased to a much higher level of $590 billion. So as you can see, the overall trade deficit in the year 21-22 has increased to $190 billion. So even though our exports have increased, our imports have also increased, and that is why the overall trade deficit of India has also increased. And if you now look at the top 5 export commodities from India for the entire financial year, that is from April 2021 to March 2022, in terms of commodity groups, the first commodity group is engineering goods, which alone account for 27% of the exports from India. It is followed by the petroleum goods, gems and jewelry, organic and inorganic chemicals, and pharmaceutical drugs. And as far as the top 5 export destinations for the entire financial year is concerned, the top 5 export destinations are USA, UAE, China, Bangladesh, and Netherlands. Now coming to the reasons for increase in India's exports to more than $400 billion. So broadly, there are two reasons for the increase in India's exports. First and foremost, there has been increase in the value of the goods that we have exported to other countries. Apart from that, there also has been an increase in the volume of the goods that we have exported to other countries. So because of increase in value as well as because of increase in volume, India has been able to achieve a milestone of $400 billion worth exports. Now, for example, if you look at the engineering goods as well as petroleum goods, the value of these goods have increased, and that is why our exports value has also increased. For example, the export value of petroleum goods have increased by 150%, predominantly on account of increase in the prices of petroleum products. Similarly, the value of engineering goods in terms of exports value has also increased by 50%. So apart from the increase in value of the goods that we have exported, we have also exported more volume of goods to other countries, and that is why our exports have also increased. Further, we have also undertaken a diversification both in terms of our export basket, that is the goods that we export to other countries, as well as in terms of our export destination, that is in terms of the countries to which we have so by broadly exporting goods to more number of countries as well as by exporting more number of goods, we have been able to achieved the milestone of $400 billion worth exports. Apart from that, the other reasons include the highest ever export of agricultural products, basically driven by the increase in export of rice, both basmati rice and non-basmati rice, marine products, spices and sugar. Please let us know in the comments section as to which agricultural commodity accounts for the highest share in terms of value in our export basket. And then the pent up demand in the export destination and efficient implementation of export promotion schemes such as RAU'S, which stands for Remission of Duties and Taxes on the Export Products. So based upon a discussion, please try to attempt these 7 prelims questions for practice. The answers as well as detailed explanation to each of these 7 questions have been provided in the DNS quiz in the ELEARN platform. As far as prelims MCQ number 7 is concerned, this particular question is about the RAU'S scheme. So in case if you don't know about the RAU'S scheme, please go through the DNS dated 22nd of April 2021, in which I have discussed in detail about the working mechanism of RAU'S scheme. With this, let us now take up the next article.
Now this article has appeared on page number 14 in today's The Hindu Delhi edition. And this article is in relation to the central bank digital currency. Now, as you all are aware, that recently RBI as well as government is planning to introduce a national digital currency which will be backed by the government, and that is why it will be called as a fiat currency. So there are a number of reasons that why the government has come forward in order to introduce the government backed digital currency. The first benefit associated with the CBDC, that is central bank digital currency, is that it will reduce the cash to GDP ratio. Second, it is expected that it will increase the financial inclusion. Third, it is one of the important mechanisms which is expected to counter the increase in the irregulated cryptocurrency market. Fourth, it is also expected to give a boost to the fintech sector, because we all know that in today's time the financial technology sector is experiencing a boom. And with the introduction of the central bank digital currency, this fintech sector is expected to rise further. So because of all these benefits, the government is planning to introduce the digital currency. Moreover, this topic was in detail covered by Basava sir in his budget session 2022 to 23, and on the basis of this very discussion you are required to attempt this particular question and answer it in the comment section below. The question says that which among the following best describes the challenge of disintermediation of banks associated with the introduction of central bank digital currency? Option A says increase in the deposits with the banks leading to higher interest cost. Option B says increase in loans given by banks leading to higher pressure on balance sheet. Option C says decrease in banks deposit with the RBI leading to lower profits for RBI. Option D says decrease in deposits with the banks accompanied by decrease in credit creation. So now is the time for the question of the day. The question asked in yesterday's DNS dated 7th April 2022 was in relation to the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. The question asked you to consider the following statements with reference to the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between India and Nepal. There were 3 statements given and you had to find the correct statement. The statement 1 said, treaty allows ease of entry and exit of citizens on both sides. Statement 2 says, a Nepali citizen can get easy employment in India. Statement 3 said, Nepal cannot trade with other nations without India's permission. Now, just going by the basis of the international relations and the concept of sovereignty, the statement 3 can be eliminated. Statement 1 and 2 both are correct, and hence option D is the correct answer. The question from today's DNS dated 8th April 2022 is in front of you. The question says that with respect to the India's international trade, you have to consider the following statements. Statement 1. India has never witnessed surplus on its merchandise trade balance in 1947. Statement 2. The trade to GDP ratio of India is higher than China. Statement 3. India has not witnessed current account surplus since 1991 economic reforms. You have to find the correct statements out of the given 3 statements. Option A is 1 only, option B 2 only, option C 2 and 3 only, option D 3 only. So that's all for today's session. All the very best. Study hard.